That's very good. Media responsibility, definitely, the media needs to look at itself in lots of ways. Just to talk a little bit about the media and Brexit for a moment, obviously, which I watched very up close. In fact, I was involved, right in the middle of it. There, I think there were a couple of things. One is, obviously, there was a number of newspapers, and they were newspapers who took a very strong anti-EU, pro-Brexit stance in a very aggressive way. And one of the things that rather surprisingly revealed was that it turned out that the print newspaper still had perhaps more influence than we imagined, because we thought that with circulations halving in 10 years and so on, and the shift online in terms of where people are getting their information from, that newspapers weren't really an important player. But it turns out that newspapers were important partly for an agenda-setting reason. In other words, they were seen as leading the debate to some extent. And I think, actually, and I'm not seeking to shift responsibility away as somebody who's a newspaper man, but I think broadcasters also slightly fell into the trap of picking up the agenda that was being set by these newspapers who, on the face of it, had rather small circulations and were largely preaching in terms of their own readers to the converted. But yes, there is a responsibility there. I think the way I see the responsibility is a rather wider one, and it speaks to the fake news issue, and in a number of different ways. I was saying earlier today in a discussion with Mark here that one of the reasons why the media did not pick up on things like the sort of insurgent politics that have characterized Europe over the last couple of years, and indeed Trump, is that we weren't speaking to the right people. And the problem, I think, for a lot of the established mainstream media is that we didn't hold a mirror up to ourselves. We were too busy talking to ourselves. If you look at the sort of structure of the media, we have become again, use the phrase mainstream media, we've become very dominated by college-educated people from the middle and wealthier classes, and we weren't a proper reflection of the societies we're writing and talking about and reporting on. And that's, I think, something that is a huge responsibility, and if we are going to, as I sort of put it at the beginning, find new impetus for politics of inclusiveness and diversity, then I think the media has to be able to really speak to and speak for the wider societies that they represent, and pick up on these trends and represent them so people feel they have a voice. Because I think we failed in that, to be honest. On the fake news thing, it's such a big and such a, again, complex issue that is about, it could be about regulation, but it's also about education. And it's about instilling some sense of responsibility. And it's also about policing and security and being smart about catching the bad guys. But for me, I think it's terribly important that we stick to a commitment to a kind of journalism that is committed to fair reporting and to finding the facts. Now, famously, there's my facts and there's your facts now. But actually, I don't think we should just give up on that at all. I really don't. And I think it's terribly important, for example, when we're mentoring and training our young journalists, to make sure that they understand that, no, they have a responsibility to seek out the truth. Now, to some extent, it's an aspiration. I remember when I was a young trainee at Reuters, and we were discussing these very issues, and a wise old bird said, look, objectivity is not something you're ever likely to attain, but you will be kept honest if you keep trying to find it. And I think that's a hugely important issue in the media, and it's very difficult now because the media is so diverse, anybody can be the media in a heartbeat. And so those of us, I think, who are in the kind of core of the professional media have a huge responsibility, And I mean, just very quickly on fake news, I think we do have to really home in and deal with the issue of the responsibility of the platforms. Because as publishers of traditional news publishers like the Financial Times, we are held liable under the law. And that's absolutely right and proper. You know, we can argue about whether the libel law should be tougher or less tough and so on, but we are responsible for what we publish. That has been deliberately avoided by the tech platforms. They're still trying to dodge the issue for all the effort they that they are putting in, and they are doing better. But I don't think they're hardly scratching the surface. And there's a very, very big societal issue there.
Okay, I'll try to be super quick. To the Turkish ambassador, welcome. I am delighted to hear you say you think Canada is a welcoming society. But I also want to express a lot of humility towards Turkey, towards Jordan, towards many of the European countries represented here. I do think it's so important when Canadians talk about diversity and pluralism and immigration. We do so with a very real appreciation of the fact that for geographical reasons, it's a lot easier for us. And, you know, maybe I should say something I perhaps should have said at the beginning. There is a very big historical challenge, which we haven't resolved yet in Canada, which is reconciliation with the Indigenous people in Canada. And that is something that we're working on, but it's really hard, and we sure haven't gotten it right yet. And I think you're very right to point to an important aspect of challenges in international relations. You know, one of the reasons that we need to collectively work hard to support the safety and prosperity of all countries around the world is when things really break down. Not only is it a tragedy for the human beings involved, but I think we have all experienced, particularly Europeans, countries close to Syria, like Turkey, like Jordan, the hugely destabilizing effects. And, you know, I think Hugh could have offered as one of the root causes of his European tour d'horizon, Syria. And that is why, you know, for Canada, we certainly feel a responsibility to have welcomed a significant number of Syrian refugees because it's everybody's problem. That is why we are leading the NATO training mission in Iraq to offer a contribution to some stabilization. It's why in our own hemisphere we are so focused on the tragedy of Venezuela and on supporting Juan Guaido as interim president. It's chiefly because we support the democratic aspirations and the constitutional rights of the people of Venezuela, but it's also because we realize our own hemisphere could be subject to some of the incredibly destabilizing refugee flows that Turkey has experienced. Now, just quickly on journalism, 3 quick things. I first want to say one thing that would be interesting to Hugh personally. On the point about needing to be diverse ourselves in order to properly cover things, I think it's a great point. And the weird thing for me is I have never worked in such a diverse group as I do working in the cabinet of Canada. And partly that's a Canadian tradition because we're such a big country. We do have a well-established tradition of having ministers from across the country. But our Prime Minister has really expanded that understanding to have created, I think, a cabinet that looks more like Canada than any other cabinet has done. And I have to tell you, just the experience of being around that table, you just learn so much more. and have so many different perspectives brought to the table. You know, I think my colleague, our wonderful House leader, Bardish Chager, I don't think she will mind my quoting a really great thing she said at one cabinet meeting, even though it's cabinet confidentiality, Ian. She won't mind, I promise you, okay? We were talking about racism and white supremacy and, you know, what did this mean for Canadians? And some of us who were white were kind of opining about meetings we had had with our constituents. And Bardish said, I'm brown, I'm a woman, I'm not that big. I can tell you how it feels to walk down the street. And all of a sudden I was like, yeah, she can. We really better listen to her. So I think that is really true. Finally, 2 points on media. Hugh said many really important things, but your point about publishers' responsibility is something that I think we have to start bringing to the conversation of digital platforms. And I think sometimes, and we had a bit of a conversation about this at the G7 foreign ministers, and sometimes we can act like the issue of what do digital platforms do with all this crazy stuff that's there, we can act like it's this incredibly complicated, difficult, impossible, how do you get your arms around it challenge. And we forget that old-fashioned mainstream media guys have been dealing with it for a really long time and dealing with it really effectively. It's hard, it's expensive. Hugh and I have both had the personal experience of being responsible for being the editor who signs off on that day's newspaper. I can tell you it's terrifying. I still remember Richard Lambert giving me a talk, but he was a great storied editor of the FT before the first time I did it. And I remember him saying, be careful about the cartoons. They're the ones that can really get you. Did he ever tell you that?
I didn't, but he should have.
Right? So, and you have to worry about the ads. But if like old-fashioned mainstream media guys who are not Silicon Valley geniuses, if like they're able to do it every day, then I think the Silicon Valley guys should be able to figure it out too. And by the way, they have a, you know, yes, it's expensive. The last time I checked, they had a lot more money than the old-fashioned media guys do. So let's not act like this is a bigger intellectual problem than it actually is. And then finally, Susan, to your point about journalists and responsibility, I agree with what people have said, but I do want to end on a note of pointing out how hard the job journalists do is, that journalists today are facing a lot of danger in a lot of countries around the world. We are at a peak of journalists being killed for doing their jobs, of journalists being imprisoned. You mentioned Reuters. 2 brave Reuters journalists are in jail in Myanmar. They do an absolutely essential job. As a politician, I can tell you, like, I've actually experienced knowing reporters are going to ask me questions. It makes me do my job better because I'm scared. I'm constantly scared of journalists. And I know that I have to have good answers to their questions. And it makes me try to do better. And so let us also really not forget that we've been talking about liberal democracy, how important it is. A vibrant, independent media that aspires to do all the great things Hugh was talking about is absolutely essential to a functioning democracy. And we need to be grateful to the hardworking, experienced journalists like my friend Hugh Carnegy who make that possible. Thank you.
So on that great note, I wanted to thank you all very much for being here this evening. There have been, and some of you are faithful, there have been many very interesting conversations in this room, but I think none maybe so probing or so optimistic in the end. So I'm hugely appreciative to Hugh Carnegie, who's come from London to join us, and to the Minister who had maybe a few other things on her mind today, but you wouldn't know it from the care and thought that she put into her comments today. So encourage all your friends to follow this on our website. Those of you who are going to be in Lisbon on June 11th, come to our next event, in which we'll have the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, Amina Mohammed, who is fantastic, talk about pluralism and development. And again, a huge thank you to both the Minister and to Hugh. Thank you very much.